Thank you, Unless Ken Corla, and thank you, deputies, for their comments this evening. And I do again want to thank them for the fact that they have allowed to waive pre-legislative scrutiny for this legislation. I do accept that this is the second piece of legislation I've brought under these circumstances, but I think as deputies themselves, while concerned about this, have also outlined that there is no committee structure currently in place. This is legislation that is only going to be enacted until the 9th of November, unless the House decides to extend it. So it is a very limited timeframe and something that we sought to enact quickly. So I genuinely want to thank deputies for their support in that. In outlining maybe just the legislation and trying to provide clarity where deputies have asked for that, before that I just want to again acknowledge the fact that the vast majority of licensed premise holders, and this is what we're talking about in this legislation, this is not about homes, house parties, anything else, publicans, gastropubs, restaurateurs, clubs, the vast majority of people are in compliance with the COVID regulations, so they will never see or have any need to engage with Gardaí on these provisions because they are in compliance, and I want to thank them for that. However, we have seen an increase in non-compliance as of this weekend. From the beginning of July through Operation Navigation, we've seen 186 breaches now, and an increase in a number where these breaches have been consistent and where individuals have breached on more than one occasion, and some even more than that. This bill only allows additional powers of enforcement to An Garda Síochána in relation to licensed premises. There was never any intention for there to be anything in this legislation around homes, around entering homes, or around house parties. So I'm not sure where that confusion came from, but that was never the case or the intention. This allows where people are in contravention of the regulations, where they have been asked and engaged with by the Gardaí and continue to flout those regulations, that they are then potentially subject to various different penalties. Firstly, where you may be closed for the remainder of the day. There's then a further stage where you can be closed for up to 3 days. There are measures where you can be closed for up to 7 days and 30 days. Both of those require a commencement notice, which has to be issued by the Gardaí before that, which again, throughout all of these, give the licence premises holder an opportunity to either object or to call into question the reason for which they are potentially going to be penalised. So there's a lot of safeguards in these, and at every stage, and I think we've seen it throughout all, and I think everybody has acknowledged the fantastic work that the Gardaí have done, and that they have used a graduated approach throughout all of COVID, and they've always looked to engage with people before they take things further, and that's absolutely going to be the case here. In relation to, I suppose, what public health regulations are going to be connected to this. And again, I understand that it can be, that because the regulations are being introduced and signed off by Minister Donnelly, there's questions as to why the regulations are not included in this. The penal provisions from those regulations are not set out in the bill, as I think there's a need for flexibility, as we have seen in the last few weeks, but over the last few months, where Minister Donnelly has needed to change regulations, probably at shorter notice than we would like, but at short notice, based on increase in figures of COVID numbers and other potential problems. If we were to have to include the penal provisions in this legislation, it would mean any time there was a change we would have to introduce legislation, and it just provides that level of flexibility. Of course, anything that's introduced by Minister Donnelly has to go through the Cabinet and has to be signed into law by himself. So there is that connection between the two pieces of between my own department and Minister Donnelly's. Specifically for this legislation, because Deputy Howlin outlined earlier the regulations that were approved on Friday at Cabinet, that were signed by Minister Donnelly on Monday, they were put up on the Department of Health website on Tuesday, yesterday. There's a lot of provisions in there that don't relate to this legislation. Specifically for this legislation, what Gardaí will have to look at where there is a penal provision, firstly is Regulation 11. This provides that a specified person, essentially the licensee or person in charge of the premises, shall ensure that members of the public are not permitted on a premises selling or supplying alcohol unless said alcohol is ordered at the same time as a substantial meal is ordered, during the meal or after the meal is ended. Regulation 13(1) provides that a specified person can ensure that, firstly, the date and time of entry of the person in the case of a party of persons to the premises is recorded along with their name and telephone number. Secondly, the date and time of entry of a person who is not part of a party or persons to the premises is recorded along with their name and telephone number. A record is made of the substantial meal or meals ordered by each person who is permitted to enter the premises, and that food and beverages are served and consumed only when the person or persons are seated at a table. You also have Regulation 13(2), which provides that a specified person shall retain the the records referred in subsection 1 for a period of 28 days. They shall make them available to the Gardaí acting in the course of their duties under the regulations or a person appointed to the Health Service Executive. So this is where the HSA come into play for the purposes of the programme commonly known as the COVID-19 Contact Management Programme. And finally, Regulation 13 provides that the above mentioned regulations in respect of businesses selling alcohol for consumption on the premises shall come into operation on the 3rd day of September 2020. So it's very clear, it's set out, I believe, not just for the premise holders themselves or the licensed premise holders themselves, but for Garda Síochána to know what it is that they're looking for when they go into these premises. But again, they can ask somebody to comply. They're not going to go in and just look to close down that premises immediately. There are a number of questions, again, and issues that have been raised, I suppose, around the fact that there may be genuine errors, and I accept that Deputy Murphy, I think, raised. There can be genuine errors, and that's why there is a number of provisions to allow for the Gardaí to engage first and foremost. It's never intended that this legislation, as I mentioned, was going to deal with house parties or dealing with any issues within the home, and I think I've made that clear. I suppose there have been maybe some questions around the fact that this could be a pathway to something else. The legislation is very clear. It will only come into effect until the 9th of November. If the House chooses, and it's not just the Dáil but the Seanad also, to extend that, then there will have to be consultation and they will have to approve that. Deputy Naughton asked previously, could I commit to doing it only on a 2-month basis? I don't want to commit to any specific time, because we might only, if at all, need to extend it for a month or whatever the time period might be. But what I can commit to is that these are temporary measures and that they would only ever, and I would only ever propose to extend them for a short and a limited period of time. Suggestions that this legislation is penalising publicans and against our publicans, absolutely not. And I've said this many times today. My parents ran a pub for probably 10 to 12 years of my life. I spent a lot of my early teens and into my adulthood working in pubs in college and beyond that. This is not legislation that I'm introducing to try and penalise pubs. This is to make sure that those who are in compliance, those who are abiding to the rules, that they can't, and that they're not looking at people who are flouting them and where there are no consequences. But also it's to ensure that those who are flouting the rules, who are putting people's health at risk, that there are some provisions there that allow the Gardaí to take further measures. When I say that I believe this is a stepping stone for wet pubs, you know, I'm not being disingenuous. I'm genuine when I say that we need to show a pathway for pubs so that they know what they need to do to be compliant, so that there can be very clear regulations and guidelines, but also that if there are breaches and if there are possible problems, that Garda Síochána know that there are mechanisms that they can have to either close a premises or to seek to have it closed at a later date. And I think that will give us a greater pathway and a greater ability to ensure that our wet pubs can open. I want to see it happen sooner rather than later. Again, I know how important pubs are in communities, particularly in rural communities. I see even our young people as well. There's very little for them to do. It's been a very difficult summer for a lot of people, and I hate the fact that a lot of what we're seeing on social media at the moment is maybe pointing to young people. I have to acknowledge it's been very difficult for everybody, where you have no outlet to go, you've had no festivals, you've had no concerts, you've had nowhere for people to go. So we wanted to try and open up our society, get things back to normal as much as possible, but do so in a safe way. And I genuinely believe by having these measures and these powers for the Gardaí that will then be connected to regulations that the Minister for Health maybe can add on the ones that I've just outlined today, that will make it safe for our pubs to open. I believe that's something that we should be doing. In terms of objecting to the renewal of licence, somebody asked, is there a timeline? I mean, I think it would be very unusual. There's nothing specified in this. It would be unusual for a guard to object outside of the particular year that's involved. Again, these regulations are due to end on the 7th of November. Licences are renewed in September, so unless something happens between now and the end of the month for certain premises, you may not have anybody have any objection to their licence, and I certainly hope that that would be the case. In terms of a document and potentially having to do it retrospectively, it's not expected that a guard would have a document to hand over on the night of the immediate closure order, but the order can be documented after or as soon as possible, and that's what's meant in the legislation. There was questions around the 6-month jail sentence, and again I have to point to the fact that there are a series of measures that have to be undertaken by Garda Síochána. They have to be the premise, the licence holder has to be negligent and not comply with those. You have measures where then it can be brought to the district court, that can be appealed to the circuit court, and it's where there have been enforcement measures put in place and those have been in breach that there can be a decision then taken to enforce again a penal provision that could include jail. But again, you know, I really can't see the likelihood of this happening at all, if in many instances, and that's why we've, you know, I suppose, tried to make sure that at all stages we're working with people and that we're bringing people on board with us. You know, again, in terms of communication, I fully accept that communication, it has been difficult over the last number of weeks, but we have come to the end of the roadmap that was initially put in place from March to August. The focus has very much been on getting our schools open, and I think everybody has been delighted to see children in uniforms, everybody trying to get back to some sense of normality this week, and I think people have appreciated that that has been the focus. And with a sudden increase in numbers over the last number of weeks, decisions have been taken at a shorter notice than we would like. Maybe decisions have been made based on public health advice and guidance, but at all times we have tried to communicate that. I understand it is often difficult. We have tried to communicate it, and I certainly want to ensure that people understand the legislation that's been introduced today. What does it do? How long is it for? What does it mean for the publicans, for restaurateurs and for any kind of clubs that have a liquor licence as well? In relation to the Act, and a number of people have talked about a sunset clause, there is a sunset clause in it. Section 17(3) very clearly says that both houses can approve an extension prior to the 9th, where there is an agreement. And again, that's something, if we were to do, that we can debate as to how long that should happen. There are various other issues maybe that strayed into other areas around COVID-19, which maybe I won't touch on today. But I just want to thank again deputies for I suppose for their support with this legislation. It's not something that we have done or that I have done lightly, but I do think it's legislation that is needed. I do think it's legislation that the Gardaí support and require to ensure that our public houses, and to ensure those that are open, that they are fully in compliance and that they have a mechanism where that isn't the case. I look forward to bringing it to committee stage tomorrow, and again I thank the deputies for their cooperation with that. If I could, just because there's been a number of comments in terms of officials and you know, somebody's after saying, you know, who wrote this legislation. I want to thank officials in my own department, because this legislation was put together very quickly, and they worked with the Attorney General and the relevant departments in setting this out, and I think they've done a very good job. I think it is as straightforward as it can be, given, as you have outlined yourself in Lasca and Corla, the complexities of what it's actually talking about. But I just want to thank them for their work in that regard.